Talk Like a Leader, What Every Employee Needs to Hear, hosted by HRDQ-U and presented by Diana Durek. Today's webinar will last around 1 hour. If you have any questions, you can always type them into the chat box. We will answer questions as they come in live at the end of the presentation or as a follow-up by email. My name is Sarah Schaefer, and I will be moderating today's webinar. Diana Durek is a leadership development specialist with an emphasis on emotional intelligence and personal change. She spent 11 years with a leading global psychological test publisher. There, she worked with clients as diverse as the U.S. Air Force, American Express, and Air Canada. She is currently pursuing a doctorate in corporate learning and development, a joint program between the Graduate School of Education and the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania. Welcome and thank you for joining us today, Diana.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you to absolutely each and every one of you on the call. I am delighted to be here today, and also a special thank you to you and to the HRDQ-U University family for inviting me back. Just thrilled. So with that, let's get started. Here's what I propose we cover today. And just a little note with respect to, I don't want to suggest that these bullets are exactly in order. And what I mean by that is, if we're going to talk about effective leadership communication, then it sort of stands to reason that we need to anchor this, if you will, in the basic question of what is effective leadership in the first place. So I'm going to cover that piece first, and then I will weave the first two bullets into this understanding, and then clearly you'll see the third bullet is going to be covered at the end. So with that, let's dive right in. I'd like for you to start with an exercise. And for this, I'd like to start by having you think of a leader who really brought out the best in you. So think of a specific person, otherwise this exercise isn't going to work. The kind of person who, whenever you were around them or you were working with them, you were charged up, you were really excited. So if they transferred to another division, you'd seek a transfer so that you could continue working with them. If it was in the community and they started a volunteer project, even though you're way too busy, you'd go ahead and volunteer for it because it's really exciting to be working with this person. So think of a specific person who brought out the best in you. Now what I'd like you to do is think of a leader for whom you have worked or with whom you have worked, who you really tried to avoid. The kind of person who made you feel, well, frankly, that, you know, whatever they were paid, it was probably too much. Somebody who, if they happened to work for your organization, the best thing that you could do to improve the performance of that organization would be to help them get a job with your competitor. So that kind of person. Here's what I'd like you to do. In thinking about each of these two people, think for a minute about how they typically would act. What did they say? What did they do? How did they make you and other people feel? And so as you're making your comparative statements, the characteristics of the person who brought out the best in you versus the characteristics of the person who did not, I'd like to invite you to write them down in the chat function. And I'll give you a couple of minutes for this, and then we'll bring it back together. Okay, I see a whole bunch of responses coming in, and I don't want to talk over. I can see that they're still pouring in, so I'm just going to give you a little bit more time. Wow, some of you are very fast typers. Okay, now I can see them just absolutely pouring in. I'm obviously not going to read all of them. But let me just sort of try to run through. Brought out the best in me, someone who empowered me. Critical, I can of course assume that was the person being critical brought out the worst in you, or caused you to underperform. Someone else said confident, that's on the positive side. On the positive, they challenged me but also made me feel comfortable. Challenged me versus belittled me. Supportive. Micromanagement, lack of trust there. Good leader, said I was his go-to person for certain things. Oh, wonderful. Developing, encouraging, firm but fair, trustworthy, asks questions versus not asking, encouraging, coaching versus telling, acknowledged contributions, valued, smart, a contributor, like I was in control of my work, respected me, encouraged me, questioned me. Trying to look just for anything that might be a little bit different. Made us feel that we were a means to an end. Blindsided, insecure, inspiring, encouraging. I mean, this list just goes on and on. So thank you just so much for the participation. I'd like to just try to summarize, even though it was so much. I'd like to try to summarize what you just wrote down. This list pretty well summarizes 80 years of empirical research on effective leadership. And if we spent more time with this, honestly, we would get just more of the same types of themes. So look at what you're saying, that the effective leadership relationship, and I'm using effective here because I specifically asked you who brought out the best in you. Because if a person is not bringing out the best in you, you are not fully using your human resource, your human capital. So if they're bringing out the best in you, there's a greater likelihood that they're effective as a leader. Certainly with you, they're effective. And the people who brought out the best in you, they talked with you. They engaged with you. They valued you. They cared about you. They asked you questions. They supported you. They encouraged you. And these are all things about building a relationship. And the people who didn't, they were things like discouraging, demoralizing, threatening, demeaning. This is really a very important distinction because what it says is that leadership is a relationship. And as a corollary to that, you can't be a leader without followers, right? So leadership is a relationship. It's really a dialogue rather than a monologue. And the research, and frankly the list that you just created, show that effective leaders are in tune with the people around them. And the people around them are in tune with them, so that you have this sense that people are in sync with one another. And this is absolutely critical because it enables you to have a flow of information. One of the stronger findings is that whenever you have a power distance in an organization, people at the lower end tend not to provide disconfirming or negative information. John Byrne called this the CEO disease in a 1991 Business Week article. And regardless of whether people do it out of fear or whether they do it because they're high-distance cultures, so certain Asian cultures will do it out of respect, for example, the person at the top is cut off from the really critical information. And very often when leaders are dissonant or demeaning, they are also cut off from information. Whereas in these resonant relationships, because trust is such a factor, as is open conversation, people tend not to get cut off, and the result is that you get more accurate information. So what do we know about great leaders? And more specifically for our purposes today, the overarching messages that they communicate. The first two messages on your screen have to do with providing context. Resonant leaders remind people of the purpose of the organization. And what this purpose or context does is exactly what vision is. It gives people a reason for why they're doing something. But great leaders usually go even beyond that. They help us to see this vision in a way that's hopeful. So in other words, they create an overall positive emotional tone. Now, I want to be clear, it doesn't mean that everything is positive, and it certainly doesn't mean that everything is pie in the sky. So it's not unrealistic hope, but there's a sense of the possibility, a sense that we can really do this together. Now, the list you just created, trust was on there quite a few times. The bottom two bullets on the screen address something really important, namely compassion. Now, I don't mean compassion in the Western sense, meaning feeling for those in pain. It's in the Confucian sense, of reaching out to others. So what we have here is the sense that people don't just understand one another, they go beyond that and communicate that they care about others, that they want to help others. And as you said, that's exactly where the trust comes in. Now, the litmus test of effective leadership, really, what it all boils down to is one question. Is the leader inspirational? Does the leader lift people up and challenge them? Does the leader get the best out of people? And if they don't, they're not an effective leader. That's what the research tells us. Now, I want to be clear. It doesn't mean that they're not a terrific strategist or that they're not a terrific problem solver or any of a whole host of really important functions that occur within organizations. But the entire role of leadership in terms of the various effectiveness studies appears to capture this notion of, does the leader activate the resources in their organization in order for the organization to move forward? So with that said, let's look at vision a little bit more carefully. International Leadership Associates conducted a study specifically with senior managers. And when they asked leaders how many of them had a vision for their organization, 82% felt that they had a very definite vision of where they wanted their companies to be. But of that 82, only 38% of respondents felt that they had actually succeeded in spreading their vision throughout the organization. Different piece of data here. Jim Kouzes, very well known to you as a leadership expert and one of the creators of the Leadership Practices Inventory Assessment. His research with co-creator Barry Posner has found that 5 of the 5 practices that make up their exemplary leadership model, leaders consistently score the lowest on 3 of the 4 questions that factor into the practice that they call Inspire a Shared Vision. So piecing together these 2 sources of data, it appears that leaders, for the most part, they do have a vision, but that for some reason, they are unable to effectively communicate it. So why is this? To get at a demonstration of sorts for this, I'm again going to invite you to please use the chat function for this. And the question for this exercise that I'd like you to answer is, please tell me what words you would use if you wanted to convince somebody that Paris, France is a great place to visit. And again, I'll just give you a minute for that. And thank you so much. Again, I see a lot of answers coming in. And again, if I don't get to you, I'm just randomly scrolling because we are limited for time. I also want to point out, I saw a question in the chat about whether this, in fact, is the chat, whether you're in the right place. And absolutely, I can see your answer. So thank you. So let me try to quickly go through what you answered in here. Extraordinary. This is interesting. A number of people were on the same wavelength. Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. But that was 3 separate answers. Relaxing, cultured, compelling, inviting, remarkable, fun, artistic, historic, romantic, iconic, rich in history, food, culture, baguettes, great food, media, culture, food, wine, beautiful language, architecture, breathtaking, one of a kind, historically significant, trying to see anything, UNESCO site, everyone must see, there's something I hadn't thought of, great body of art, Eiffel Tower, magnificent, what's in it for me? I'm not sure if that's a question or if the person who wrote that in is wondering what's in it for them. Unique, intriguing. Again, thank you so much for your participation. That's wonderful. If you look at all of the things that you just listed, for the most part, and I don't mean all, but for the most part, they are predominantly emotional reactions. So not to suggest you would know this off the top of your head, but what I don't see are things like, GDP, the population, the area, the number of cities, those sorts of facts. But rather, this is emotionally based content. And organizational visions are written in similarly emotional language, but they're not always communicated this way. So what do I mean by this? Successful leaders engage our emotions, and this is critical because of how our brains are wired. One part of our brain processes emotional information, while another part handles more cognitively oriented processing. Now, the neural circuits of the emotional brain are shorter and therefore faster than the cognitive, which is a much slower processor. So it is very clear that human beings feel before we think. Our reactions to things come before any kind of thought. And this means that almost everything we process, be that information in a decision-making process, a social interaction, we're going to process it first emotionally. And just to be crystal clear, we are always processing information at a cognitive and at an emotional level. So when leaders don't communicate vision with the affect and the emotion required, and instead only focus on more factually based things, analytics, financials, gap analysis, they lose out on the significant opportunity that they have to inspire others. Again, this is based on how our brains are wired. So these other things, the financials, the gap analysis, obviously they're important, but they do not inspire. People want and in fact need to know where the organization is going and what it's going to look and feel like in the future. And people also want to be included in this search for a more meaningful future. Interestingly, while I was preparing for this webinar, I received a wonderful story yesterday from someone who actually said he was planning on participating today. And here goes the story. Back in 1971, apparently, as this story goes, someone commented to Mike Vance. Mike Vance was the creative director of Walt Disney Studios at the time. And somebody commented to him, "Isn't it too bad that Walt Disney didn't live to see this?" And he was specifically referring to Walt Disney World. And Mike Vance's awesome response was, he did see it, and that's why it's here. And similarly, I'll offer a quotation from Johnny Ive, the SVP of Design for Apple. And in this quotation, he expresses sadness that Steve Jobs never saw the new Apple campus that is in the process of being built. Now, I can imagine that this second story parallels the Disney story. Now, I frankly may be going out on a limb here, but I imagine that Steve Jobs did envision the new campus, and that it is his vision that continues to drive this project forward today. This is the kind of clarity that we're looking for. Now, I'm not suggesting that it's easy. It can be difficult to attain, but it's essential that leaders seek the knowledge and also master the skills necessary to envision what's across the horizon. And I'll discuss credibility in a moment, But I want to point out that compared to all of the other qualities that people expect of leaders, being forward-looking, so having this vision of this desirable future is the one that most distinguishes leaders from other credible people. Now, with that said, this now leads me into some very specific messages that leaders need to communicate. And just a note of what this piece is going to look like, I've pulled all of the remainder of the content from HRDQ's reproducible training material, and that material is intended for a comprehensive training, not what we have left, a 40-minute webinar. So what I did is I pulled some examples of some of the most powerful messages, but I'm not going to speak to every bullet that's on every slide. So with that said, let's move to our first leader message. Getting back to the vision, as it turns out, it's actually not enough to just communicate the vision. According to the research, people will not follow a vision until they accept it as part of their own. So in order for this to happen, people have to believe that leaders understand their needs and have their interests at heart. So in order to encourage people to commit to the vision, leaders must know the hopes, the dreams, the visions of those they lead, not just the vision for the organization. And this is what we mean by describing benefits to employees. As an example of show your passion, I just printed out the most recent holiday letter that Apple CEO Tim Cook wrote to everybody in the company. Now, rather than, it's a one-page letter, so I promise you, I'm not going to read you the letter, but I've pulled out a few examples of his emotionally based content, if you will. So just a few examples. I'm immensely proud of the work that you and your teams are doing. Different paragraph. Year after year, the Mac gets better because we love it, and we can't stop thinking about the possibilities for what it can do. How often do you hear the word love when you're talking about something within an organization? Very evocative. Another paragraph starts with, I'm thrilled to announce that, and then he goes on. He ends the letter with, I could not be more excited about what's in store for next year and for the opportunity to work with all of you to make it happen. The other thing that he does exceptionally well in this letter is that he uses a lot of inclusive phrases. So literally every single paragraph, right in the second line, together we have reached new heights. We've made important decisions, and I'd like to point out, it's all about we've made these decisions. Together, as a team, we've done this. As a group, our stores have done this. Another line, together we're also making an impact. So my point is, when I read that letter, I can honestly say, I thought, how great must it feel to know that the head of the company that you work for really seems to, and I don't think it's an exaggeration to say this, really shares his love for the company and really seems to be giving the impression that he loves working there, that he absolutely loves what he's doing. That's what this part about the passion and using the inclusive phrases, that's what this is all about. How does this fit with our vision and our strategy? And I think, again, it is probably best if I provide an example of sorts. So for those of you not familiar with the company, IAMS is a premium pet food company. And its mission is improving the well-being of dogs and cats. So as the story goes, in the late 1990s, the CEO at the time was Clay Mathieu, and he was approached by one of the leading business magazines of the day and asked to be the subject for a cover story. I mean, that's a really big deal for a CEO. And he turned it down. So you think most business leaders would have jumped at that opportunity. But when he was asked why he didn't accept, Mathieu is rumored to have said, and I'm quoting directly now, I just can't see how that would improve the lives of dogs and cats. This is exactly what this message is talking about. It's a really great example of leading by example and using the organization's mission and vision to really drive decisions on a day-to-day basis. Here's what you can do and why you should do it. And again, we give you a story. So the crux of this issue is that each and every person needs to be clear not only on the organizational goals, but also on how their job relates to these goals. So right now, Apple has about 98,000 employees. And each person is crystal clear on how their job relates back to the organization's vision. And they also know exactly what they are expected to do next. And this comes from Forbes.com. They have a very specific process for doing this. And I want to be clear, this is not a project management process. This is a concept, literally, that extends down through the ranks. This is really the embodiment of their accountability mindset. And they call it the DRI, which stands for Directly Responsible Individual. So any effective meeting at Apple will have an action list, and next to each action item will be the DRI. So whenever you're trying to figure out who's the right contact on a project, who's responsible for that project, you simply ask somebody who the DRI is. And according to just all that has been written about this concept, it really has permeated throughout the entire organization. I'm going to move now. I think we've had quite a bit around vision. I want to move now to the importance of credibility. And again, I'm going to touch on the brilliance of Jim Kouzes and Barry Posner again. They have done some extraordinary research into what people most admire and look for in leaders. So I mentioned this earlier when I said that being forward-looking is the quality that most distinguishes leaders from other credible people. And by credible people, I mean, you know, people that we would have a tendency to have faith in, to believe. So physicians, journalists, although that might not be a great example this week, people in the military, clergy, and the like. So Jim Kouzes and Barry Posner, literally for probably about 30 years now, they have found that what people look for in the leaders whom they are willing to follow has remained consistent, not just over all these years, but also across countries. It's pretty incredible. And people want leaders who are, yes, forward-looking and inspiring, which we've already covered, but also competent and honest. So those four things: forward-looking, inspiring, competent, and honest. Now, here's the crux around credibility, though. When they reviewed their own findings, what Kouzes and Posner realized was that 3 of these 4 essential leader qualities, and specifically now the 3 that they're referring to, so inspiring, competent, and honest, it turns out these 3 qualities are strikingly similar to qualities that make up what is known as source credibility. Source credibility has to do with how believable we find a source of communication to be. And for people who study communication, source credibility is made up of dynamism, expertise, and trustworthiness. So in other words, going back to those leadership qualities of inspiring, competent, and honest, 3 of the 4 qualities that we most want in our leaders are exactly the same qualities that lead us to determine that someone is. And this makes credibility the #1 reason that people follow someone. Let me say that again. There is not a more important aspect to leadership than credibility. Truly, above everything else, we have to be able, we need, perhaps is a better word, we need to be able to believe our leaders. We want to follow those who are credible. And by the way, being an expert on this slide refers to having the knowledge and skill to lead and get things done. It doesn't in any way mean having to know everything, and it certainly doesn't mean being a know-it-all, if you know what I mean. Now, I also said earlier that communicating vision requires high emotion and high affect. I want to underscore that it's really important to always remain authentic and genuine in this expression, because this too feeds back to the credibility piece. And you know, I've been using Apple quite a bit here, so I'll round out my Apple stories with this. We all know, you've all seen Steve Jobs give a presentation, and really he was a larger-than-life figure, extremely dynamic. But I would submit to you that Tim Cook is also very powerful. I mean, for myself, I found the message in his holiday letter really extremely powerful. But it was communicated in a passionate way. I mean, certainly he showed his passion for the business. He showed his team spirit, but he showed it in a softer way. And that's what's authentic and genuine, and that's what therefore makes him credible to those who work at Apple and beyond. I actually want to continue with this credibility theme a little further, but in order to do this, I'd like to invite you to help get us started by giving us your response to this next poll question. All right, so I'm going to give it we're about half of you have answered so far, a little bit more, but the numbers actually are not bouncing around a lot. Okay, so I will close out the poll now. And there you have your results. Thank you. We did get about 70% of you participating in the poll. So in the last 6 months, have you not done something that you said you would do? Not done something. And just over 70% of you, there was some obligation that you were not able to fulfill. Do what you say you will do. So in response to our roughly, and I put myself, by the way, I'm in the 70% category. I will say this, and I will also tell a story from my own experience. Leaders keep their word. Strong leaders keep their word, and they follow through on promises. And their actions and their words are consistent. And as a corollary to this, of course, to be credible in action, leaders need to be clear on what their own beliefs are in the first place. Now, back to our 70%, I fully understand with how busy we are that, one, this is extremely difficult, but two, sometimes some of these things that we promise to do, they can even seem trivial. But I'd really like to emphasize here that even the simplest of actions that leaders follow through on can have, honestly, a profound effect on how they are viewed as a leader. Behavior begets behavior. And I mean, I think the easiest way is an example. A number of years ago, I had the privilege of working with, I mean, honestly, the most reliable, trustworthy, high-integrity person that you could ever wish to work with. Now, I didn't know him well, but I knew all of these things about him, both because of his reputation, but also my own limited interactions with him. And I admit, don't know quite how to phrase this, but early in my career, I kind of thought, you know, that sort of good enough was good enough, if you will. So after our project had ended, I promised him some feedback. And I remember this like it was yesterday, and we're going back, I mean, I'm going to say a decade and a half. So it was 9 o'clock on the night that I had promised this to him by. And the issue wasn't that I hadn't sent it. The issue was I hadn't even written it. It had just been such a busy time professionally, so I hadn't started it. But when I considered putting it off until the next day, I couldn't do it. He had so inspired me by his example. And I just knew, at least intuitively I knew, that he would never do that to me. And I couldn't let myself let him down and possibly change how he felt about our relationship. So while his standards weren't my own, I aspired to his standards, and then they became my own. So not only was he a great leader, but he really helped draw me toward that vision for myself. Behavior begets behavior. Next message, all around accountability. Now, lately, I don't know what it is, but it seems that every article I see, or at least every second article I see, is now related to trust. Accountability builds trust. And, I mean, honestly, mea culpa may be the two most important words that a leader can use. We all have examples of leaders who don't accept accountability, you know, who tend to push blame to others or find excuses, people who try to hide behind their behaviors. Jim Collins, in his bestseller Good to Great, he tells us to get the right people on the bus, but poor leaders throw us under the bus. And I think, sadly, that you can all nominate someone who at some point has thrown you under the proverbial bus. And you don't need me to tell you about the impact that this had on you. Is there a better way? All of the questions on this slide, or all of the communication on this slide, if you will, really boils down to a leader constantly asking, what would you do differently? How can we make this better? We respond to leaders who bring us in, right? People like to feel involved. But people also respond to a leader who's working hard to understand something, to make things better, to create something, to build something that draws us in, something so compelling. Back to the caring. We touched on this a little earlier when we said that what leaders need to know about the hopes, dreams, and visions of those they lead is critically important if they're going to help those individuals commit to a vision. So if I put this really simply, if you don't know what drives people, how could you possibly know what mode of transport they want? By the way, sometimes I hear people say, oh, it's not personal, it's business. That statement, it's just business, that statement could not possibly be true based on the research. It has to be personal. Even though we're in a business setting, it has to be personal, because the entire essence of leadership, like we explored at the beginning, is about getting the best out of people. And in so doing, getting things done through other people. So take the time to get to know people, not just on a business level, but on a personal level. And that is business. All right, which brings us to one of my favorite topics, which is listening. The challenge with listening is that oftentimes when we ask people questions, rather than listening to the answer, we're actually preparing for what we're going to say next. Now, if you've not noticed this in yourself, another parallel that I can draw for any of you who may have teenagers who are learning to drive, if you watch people learning to drive, when they first stop at stoplights or stop signs, that's actually quite difficult to say, when people first stop, instead of actually coming to a full stop, they tend to come to this rolling stop because instead of thinking about stopping, they're actually thinking about the next maneuver they're going to make. They're not thinking about the lack of movement. They're thinking about where they're actually moving next. Listening, it really tends to be the same way. And it's particularly common in people who are not very empathic. And I mean, you can see clearly how seriously this would affect communication. In some people, this tendency can be so strong that even if they do ask questions, they're not even asking genuine questions, but more like, I'm going to call them cleverly designed statements. I caught myself actually saying this to my husband the other day, and I was a little appalled once I did it. I said, "You're not going to leave that there, are you?" Well, I can assure you that's not a question, and I certainly don't remember what his answer was, because I really wasn't asking that to actually get information. I'm going to give a couple of tips just because I think that this is such an important issue for us. So if you are one of these people and you find yourself really not listening to people, here's something that you can try. And the first step is, frankly, just to really concentrate on making an effort to move yourself back to what is being said. But secondly, that's not going to be enough if you're someone who does this all the time. So then consciously give yourself permission to not filter the conversation through your values. It's not about your values or your feelings or your thoughts. You are listening to understand the other person. And good communication does not require that you agree with the other person. It doesn't require that the other person see things or understand your point of view. And in addition, if you use words that reinforce to the other person that you were listening, that's also, it's going to help that other person, but it's also going to help you to stay in this critical listening mode. When we don't hear what is being said, we cut ourselves off from important information. And the more, remember that the more that leaders rise in an organization, the further they often are from direct contact with the customer. So in order to make good business decisions, they have to rely on getting this perspective. They have to rely on listening to other people. I also want to, just a quick story on the left bullet on the screen around availability. I said a minute ago that it's important to be, to engage on a personal level and learn something about people as people. Now, there are those who just don't do that. But in addition, there are those who do it, but then when times get tough, they stop doing it. I want to tell a quick but I think quite powerful story. Anne Mulcahy was the CEO of Xerox from 2001 to early in 2009. And she inherited, for those of you who don't know the state of Xerox at that time, she inherited honestly an extreme challenge. And all the advisors were suggesting to her that she file for bankruptcy. And in having to trim expenses, that included 28,000 jobs. Now, no one would suggest that that is an easy situation. And not to be glib, I mean, 28,000 people lost their jobs. But she, even at a time that was so difficult, she walked the halls and she told people she was sorry. She was available. She met with her top 100 executives and basically told them, this is going to be really tough. Let me tell you the hard facts here. But she spent time with each and every one of them. And interestingly, the research clearly suggests that where there is a lack of trust, the minute times are tough, people will jump ship. And that's not just executives now. I'm just talking about people in general. But it was a real tribute to her ability to be available for her team. 98 of the 100 executives chose to stay even though they knew how difficult it was going to get. And that suggests that with the amount of time that she spent with people, she then engendered that trust. And by the way, there was another story that then followed up with that top team. Many of those 98 executives are actually still with Xerox today. All right. What can I say here? Nothing undoes trust faster than leaders who, talk out of both sides of their mouth, who share information when they shouldn't, who don't share information when they should, and take too much of the credit and pass out too much of the blame. Now, it's important to remember that there are very real consequences when leaders create distrust and when they tear down others and threaten crises. This creates stress in people, and stress sets off our sympathetic nervous system, and you can think of the sympathetic nervous system as the classic stress response. The most important part of the stress response is that first, our brain starts to systematically shut down its non-essential neural circuits. So we're not as open to or in touch with as many parts of our brain, what we actually know. And second, we disengage our immune system and stop the creation of new neurons. So we actually can't learn when we're stressed out. So when we're in this chronic stress, we're starting to close down. So when leaders lead organizations by managing the negative, by talking about the threat, talking about the urgency in terms of the crises that are going to happen, they create this kind of toxic response in our bodies, and we shut down. So think about the irony here. One of the things we hire people for is their IQ and technical skills, but the impact of these negative leader communications, so lack of trust and tearing us down, the impact is that we actually can't fully access what we already know in the first place. And just a couple more messages. Going back to the lists that you created at the very beginning of this webinar around who brought out the best in us, the things on this slide would have come out in the things that you wrote that were like, these leaders were real. You could count on those people. And interestingly, sometimes when we hear public apologies, those made by sports figures, for example, or those made by political figures, I've noticed that they will apologize for how we took something, or they'll apologize for how we reacted rather than for what they actually did in the first place. So to sum this one up, we all strong leaders need to mean what they say. And which brings me down to the issue of help. And truly, this all boils down to what can I do to help? What do you need? What obstacles can I remove in order to allow you to do whatever it is that you need to do? And it's really important here to when we think of help, to think about how it is that we're going about and doing this. And I think it's easiest, I'm fumbling for words here, so I think I'll give you an example. Years ago, and now we're probably going back 2 decades, I worked for an organization, and out of the blue, a customer of ours invited me to give a presentation. And at that time, there were probably about 40 more people in the company, likely, if not more qualified, then certainly more experienced. But this person, for whatever reason, had openly stated that she wanted to become a mentor to me and really gave me an amazing opportunity. And even though it was a lot of work and it stressed me out, nonetheless, I rose to the challenge, and it was actually a very positive, very reinforcing experience for me. The reason I tell this story is that to me, and more importantly, in terms of the research, that is really critical. When we look at the people, or when the research looks at who are the people who have helped others develop the most in their careers, it's always about people who have helped them identify new dreams or formulate some part of their personal vision, or somebody who really helped them, like my client did, somebody who helped identify a strength that perhaps you didn't know you had. Sometimes when we try to help someone, or conversely, when someone tries to help us, we do it the wrong way. We sort of social engineer people. We try to fix them. But think about this. When was the last time that you changed because somebody told you to? The people who helped you the most, they didn't do that. They didn't try to fix you. What they did was inspire you. And with that, I hope that something you heard today, a nugget here and there that has inspired you to perhaps look into some ideas more deeply and perhaps apply some of these things in your own work lives or in your work with others. And with that, I will turn it back to Sarah and ask about any questions.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Diana. And actually, let me go ahead and, if you would like to get in contact with Diana, her contact information is actually on that screen right now. So like you said, we do have some time for your questions. So attendees, would you please send those into your chat window now? And while we wait for those questions to come in, let me share a little bit about the program that is the foundation of today's session. And that would be Talk Like a Leader. This is a half-day classroom training program that cuts through the noise to focus on 4 key areas of leadership communication. And you can always review this set for 30 days risk-free, and you will be receiving a coupon code in your email after this session, which is good until March 4th, and you can shop there at HRDQstore.com. So, okay, and it looks like we have several questions coming in, so why don't we go ahead and get this started. Our first question looks like it's coming from Jen, and she wants to know, are there phrases that leaders should avoid?
Oh, well, Jen, perhaps we could inspire HRDQ to create an additional module. What I would suggest, going back to that slide where what I was talking about, the toxic response that leaders can create when they are demeaning, when there's a lack of trust, when they, throw us under the proverbial bus, and so on. So for starters, I would suggest that I would avoid any of those behaviors that cause us that kind of stress. But a little bit tongue-in-cheek, if I was just to answer the question at face value, one of the phrases that, and I don't want to take this out of context, but one of the phrases I really don't like from a leader is, here's what I think. Now, I'm not suggesting you never give your opinion, but what I'm suggesting is, remember, it's all about including others and getting invaluable perspectives and as many of them as you can. So what we don't want from a leader is, I've made the decision, this is what we're doing, this is the way it's going to be. So any of that type of response is how I would answer that question. Thanks for the question, though. It's a very insightful one.
Okay, perfect. And our next question looks like it's coming from Nicole, and she wants to know, I've noticed some generational differences in expected communication styles. How can today's leaders make sure their communication includes everyone?
That is an awesome question, and I'm almost embarrassed to say I don't know that I don't think I've ever experienced this question, but I will say this, and I'm not going to speak specifically to generational differences. I'm going to speak to any differences. So, for example, some of my work also involves personality characteristics. And so we like to do things in our group training that will address extroverts And we also like to address things that are more introverted, for example. There are those who really like to do more action learning type of activities and those who do not. So what I would suggest is that we always use a mixture of the words and phrases and the values. Just give a little bit to everybody. And I've seen leaders in meetings where they're exceptionally effective, where you can actually see where they're matching a particular concept or way of speaking to a given person in the room. It is highly, highly effective. Even as I hear myself saying this, it may sound laborious, but when you get into the habit of doing it, it actually isn't, and a really empowering process to be sure.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. And our next question is coming in with no name, but they want to know, how do you approach a situation when you know your leader is being dishonest?
Whew. Now the challenge there, and I can appreciate why there's no name. The challenge for me there is that there can be, for starters, it's not clear from that question exactly where the dishonesty lies. So for example, as a leader, you can't always share everything. And so I would first want to know sort of the source of the dishonesty. The other thing I would want to know, and again, it's not clear to me if this is happening in front of a lot of people, if this is happening privately, but I would ask a lot of questions and see if through a questioning process that some of the, I'm going to call them real facts, don't emerge. Now, I'm feeling a little sheepish in that I just feel like there's so many variables in that question. I'm going to stop there. I could probably talk around it for 15 more minutes. Certainly, if this is something that you would like to send me an email on or pass a question through HRDQ, I would certainly be happy to provide more context if you provide me with some more context first.
Okay, great. Thank you. And looks like we probably have time just for one more question. And this one is coming from Allie, and she wants to know, some people seem to be naturally strong leaders. Do leadership skills just come naturally to some people?
You know, that is very possibly the most common question that is asked at every session on leadership, regardless what the topic. And I will say unequivocally, these are learned skills, like no question. I do believe, and more importantly, the research suggests, though, that they are learned skills, so that means we didn't see as these leaders were grappling with these things. And if you go into the histories, especially of top CEOs, for example, when they were young children, they often played on sports teams. They often had opportunities to work on teams or to exhibit other leadership behaviors like influence. You know, maybe they were part of a Girl Scout. I think they're called troops. You know, maybe they were part of a volunteer organization. But you always find that somewhere along the line, you know, the leader had to learn those skills somewhere. So great question, though, but absolutely we need to spread the word that these are actually very, very learnable skills, for sure.
Yes, and great, thank you. And would you like to add any final thoughts, Diana?
Only, you know, I'm looking on the screen, and I'm looking at everything that Talk Like a Leader includes. And of course, for everyone on the call watching, clearly I didn't cover all of those things. So I just encourage you, I hope that this has given you a sample of the kind of content that's in there, but just know that everything from a leadership training, everything is covered in the program in great detail to the same depth as what I did present in our hour together.
All right, great. Well, Diana, thank you again. It's always a pleasure working with you. And for the attendees, if we didn't get to answer your question, you will receive an emailed response probably early next week. So we appreciate your time, and we hope you found today's webinar informative. Thanks.
Thank you.